A former at-large D.C. council candidate wants to propose a ballot initiative to create what would effectively be black-only cities by breaking apart regions in Washington, D.C. into what he describes as autonomous zones. Now, the reason I say these are cities is because they would have their own mayors and legislative bodies. Now, let's be real. This sounds absurd on its face, likely will never go anywhere, and is probably a violation of several laws. But it shows us the sentiment and the ideology of prominent Black Lives Matter activists. Now, I don't want to pretend like this guy is one of the most famous guys in the world, but he has been quoted in the press and has been active as an activist with Black Lives Matter for at least 5 years. You know, I checked this by going and looking at some news articles and seeing that he had been quoted in other areas. Again, I'm not going to pretend like this is the most influential guy in the world or anything like that, but I do believe it is indicative of a larger ideological push among Black Lives Matter identitarians, of which is some kind of balkanization, racial segregation, and we've seen it pushed in many different ways. There is the very famous diversity, inclusivity, and equity training, where they segregated it based on race. Some people could be you can go to the training if you are white or if you're POC or not POC. We saw, I think it was in Michigan, where they had the cafes for non-POC and POC individuals. And many people basically said, you're creating like a white-only digital meeting space. We've seen more and more and more of this. They call it caucusing, or they call it affinity groups. In Sacramento, the school district actually proposed creating white racial affinity groups to have white people share in their white history. And that to me is just absurd. We are moving backwards. Now, at a time when we are talking about an increasingly positive sentiment towards U.S. balkanization, we're hearing conversations about civil war, and Joe Biden himself says that the Republicans' voting laws, the Republican voting bills they're proposing, are the greatest threat since the Civil War. That is the perspective of the President of the United States of America. You don't have to like the guy. You can disagree with him. But the dude sits in the office and is saying right now, if Republicans want to pass these bills, they are threatening us more so than the Confederacy did. Now, that's insane, because many others, at least half the country, at least every Donald Trump voter has the perspective that Democrats' lax voting bills are a bigger threat. The president himself is saying we are facing this threat. If you are an adamant supporter of the Republican Party, of which there are at least 75 million, he's saying what you would vote for is a bigger threat than the Confederacy. So we have this article. Many conservatives are mocking Ken Burns for saying that this is the most fraught time in American history, and they're laughing, saying, the Civil War was crazy. Are you nuts? And I'm like, dude, just because we had a civil war does not mean we are not entering a worse period. Where we are right now may be the precursor to something truly awful. I hope that's not the case. But there's increasing sentiment. And when the president himself is no longer addressing the Republican Party or Trump supporters, clearly this country is more than just divided. It is bifurcated completely. So I'm unfortunately bullish on the idea of some kind of collapse or break apart or loss of confidence, but I'm not convinced anybody knows exactly how it will play out. I think civil war is possible, but regional conflict probably makes more sense. And due to some polling and some conversations, I think balkanization might actually be the likely outcome. That is to say, each different region may just form its own union of like-minded individuals, and more people are filtering themselves by ideology. People in big blue cities are leaving and going to bluer states, and people who are Democrats in red states are leaving to blue states. People who are conservative in blue states and cities are moving to rural areas. Case in point, myself lived in New York, moved to the Philly suburbs because I'm like, hey, the suburbs are better. And now I'm out in the middle of nowhere. People are filtering themselves. The more they do this, the more likely we are, in my opinion, to head towards some kind of peaceful divorce or major conflict. It's funny that they would mock this idea that we are in a more fraught position, that conservatives would do this. And I'll point to these, and I'll read through the story and talk about these individuals. When you have a story like this, a BLM activist who ran for DC council, that's basically the local government for DC. It's a federal, jurisdiction. He wants to create black-only cities. Now, I hope whatever balkanization hits, it will not be based on race. And I should say, I hope it doesn't happen. I hope we get through this. I don't want China to take over. The United States, the U.S., needs to stand strong. Well, let's read this story so I stop ranting. Before we do get started, head over to timcast.com, become a member, and you'll get access to exclusive members-only segments from the Timcast IRL podcast. You'll get an ad-free experience. We are working out a lot of the bugs, so I apologize for those that have seen these bugs, but you will get great articles produced by our journalists, and your membership allows us to hire more people. The next people we'll bring on are fact checkers. They're going to be operating independently from our newsroom so that we can have hard fact checking, but not just fact checking. They're going to be frame checking, making sure that our headlines aren't framed poorly or out of context. We're going to try and be as rational and moderate as possible because we want you to decide based on the evidence presented. Go to timcast.com, become a member, but don't forget, like this video right now, subscribe to this channel, smash that like button, the notification bell, assuming it does anything. Share this video with your friends. If you think I do a good job, sharing is the most important way to support this work. It's how we do more. It's how we expand. It's how we maintain what we're doing. Here's the story from timcast.com. Former at-large D.C. Council candidate to propose ballot initiative to create autonomous African-American zones in D.C. And I will stress, the reason I refer to them in the thumbnail as cities is because they would have their own mayors. This is a man named Addison Sarter is expected to propose the new initiative called the Black Autonomy Act. Sarter's proposed legislation would create autonomous African-American zones within D.C., complete with their own mayor and legislatures. Sarter dropped out of the race for a D.C. council member prior to the election. The areas that Sarter is reportedly eyeing include Anacostia, Langdon, Brentwood, Shepherd Park, according to local D.C. reporter Martin Ostermole. Ostermole basically said what I've already read. Sarter wrote about his proposal in April, saying that if it passed, it will preserve predominantly African-American sections in D.C. as historically African-American autonomous regions. Quote, these African-American autonomous regions would be turned into their own cities, with their own mayor and own city council members, operating separately and free from control by the present D.C. government, the activist wrote. He said that to deny African-Americans autonomous regions in D.C. would be denying us our basic human rights. I'm sorry, bro. The last thing we want is codified hard racial segregation. As somebody who grew up in Chicago, for those that aren't familiar, we had a dividing line. 47th Street. You crossed north of that, every single house owned by a black family or black individuals. South of that, fairly mixed, but mostly white, some Hispanic. And then if you go down east about a mile or two, Hispanic. That's the racial segregation of Chicago. And it's unfortunate. It's sad, in my opinion. I don't like that. I think people should be able to live together and be happy, but there's a lot of things that influence this, and a lot of people make choices to live in these areas, to be around people that look like them. And it is unfortunate that happens. So considering that, the last thing we want is to codify it. Chicago is famous for redlining. That was where they said, here are the areas where we're going to sell to black families near the red line. It's the Chicago train station. It's the Chicago train line, the red line. You also have the practice of blockbusting. These practices enforced racial segregation. I don't want to say inadvertently, but not directly. They were basically like, well, actually, no, redlining was legit racial segregation. Blockbusting was using racism to basically profit and scare people, and it basically made racism worse. Now you have somebody who's a BLM activist saying we should actually codify this jurisdictionally with enforcement from the government. That's probably not going to go anywhere, but understand the ideology of what these Black Lives Matter activists want. They say, while the idea has been panned online as blatant segregation and a terrifying glimpse into the goals and direction of the Black Lives Matter movement, Sarter claims that his idea is not segregation. Quote, African autonomy is not segregation. African autonomy is simply the act of African-American people controlling the institutions in our communities. This initiative would not prevent African-Americans from being able to live or travel to the rest of D.C. west of the Anacostia River. This bill would not prevent white people and non-African Americans from being able to travel east of the river. An example would be how today there are Native American reservations that non-Native Americans are allowed to visit. Yes, but there would be what? A tribal council? Race-based government. That's literally what this individual is proposing. Again, I'm not going to pretend like this guy is a famous BLM activist, but you need to understand that this sentiment, these ideas are persistent and widespread. Maybe not as extreme as this, but I've seen it. Oster Moll, the reporter from DC for NPR, pointed out that this measure is unlikely to make it to the ballots due to limitations under the Home Rule Act, which provides for an elected mayor and a city council for the District of Columbia. The Home Rule Act also gives Congress the authority to block any laws passed by the DC Council, which has been done several times. Sarter claims that African Americans continue to be systematically prevented from controlling the institutions in our communities. This is why this initiative is being proposed. DC currently has a black female mayor, Muriel Bowser. The majority of the city's mayors, since the Home Rule Act was enacted in the 70s, have been people of color, beginning with the very first, Walter E. Washington. According to his bio on the Wider Circle staff page, Sarter was born and raised in DC and graduated from Landon School in 2012. He is currently a sophomore at Montgomery College, majoring in business with hopes of transferring to the University of Maryland in College Park. He started working for Wider Circle in April of 2013. Now, I'm not sure exactly, what this guy's future plans are. And I want to absolutely stress for the 50 billionth time. Sure, maybe this is just one random guy, but he's trying to run for office. That's more that I can say for the other millions of BLM activists. This is someone who is trying to be in office. Now, again, running as an independent, not a Democrat, and withdrawing before the general election. These are fair points to be made. But a lot of people are highlighting what this guy is proposing is extreme, and it's effectively critical race theory. James Lindsay saying critical race theory exists to tear apart a nation. We have this post from Medium where on April 2nd, Sarter talked about the African American Autonomy Act of 2021, breaking down exactly what it would be. We get the general idea of what this is, but this idea has been around since even before then. He posted something about this even in March. These are ideas that don't just come from a vacuum. I have seen the pro-segregation activist statements. I have been on the ground during these riots where these people have, in no uncertain terms, said straight up that they want segregation. From the Washington Post, they point out this is 2016, he was 22 and a student at Howard University, saying that the Dallas shooting served as a wake-up call for the Black Lives Matter movement. They couldn't go up against the government. Effectively, they needed to go into government. He talks about how powerful they were and talks about his work with the Anacostia Library. So this is somebody who has, his meetings at these places, somebody who has been actively engaged in, this activism. Now, I want to throw it to this article here from Fox News. After seeing what some of these activists say, we have this article, Civil War filmmaker Ken Burns ridiculed for arguing its most fraught time in U.S. history. For a guy who delivers history, he seems to forget it. So they mock. They say Ken Burns, the filmmaker known for his award-winning Civil War documentary, was mocked for referring to America's current climate as the most fraught time in the history of the Republic. Citing COVID-19 misinformation and battles over election laws, Burns argued the U.S. is in dire straits. Quote, "We're at this desperate place," Burns said on the 11th hour with Brian Williams. "The convergence of all those viruses, the side effects of the misinformation and the paranoia and the lying, voter suppression, and then the rewriting of our history are saying that we're not interested in facts. We're not interested in the truth. We're not interested in the many varied voices that make us up. Those factors, along with Republicans who he said want to run against the government, drew him to the conclusion that this is the most fraught time in the history of our republic. Media critics were quick to note that Burns, who Newsbusters referred to as the Civil War guy, had already proved himself wrong when he created his miniseries. Newsbuster said pompous PBS star Ken Burns thinks now is the most fraught time in our history. The Civil War guy. Is this just tribalism? I'd say so. I'm absolutely astounded by the mockery of this guy, because if you've got people who clearly don't align with you and a president who says that the laws you deem necessary are the greatest threat since the Civil War, y'all need to wake up. The president himself. I can already hear a lot of people screaming about what that statement really means. The president, Joe Biden, he's in the White House. Kamala Harris, VP, whether you like it or not. And they come out and say you and what you deem necessary is a bigger threat than the Confederacy. Wake up. Now, we can try and push back on this and say, shut up and stop. We need to maintain a strong union lest China start taking over, or even Russia, of all countries. But I don't know if there's anything that can be done. Too many people, even people I respect, call for peaceful divorce, and the sentiment is rising. I did the math. 37.2% of people in this country are in favor of their region breaking off from the U.S. and forming a regional union outside of the United States. They go on a report. Ken Burns, don't watch my Civil War documentary, which proves me wrong, says Dan Gaynor. Ken Burns is a famous documentary filmmaker, but for a guy who delivers history, he seems to forget it. In Burns' assertions, Gaynor argues the filmmaker is omitting both the 1860s and the 1960s, the latter of which featured the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, Senator Bobby Kennedy, and civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. The decade was also marked by widespread protests over the unpopular Vietnam War, yes. But most people were not at each other's throats every single day. Now, I've heard the arguments. People say the weather underground, bombing campaigns. Yeah, I wasn't alive for all that. A fair point. I wasn't alive, so I don't know. The Vietnam War, the protests, drafting, the Kent State massacre, the killing of Martin Luther King Jr., of people like John Lennon. Whether you think that was a crazy person or something political, there was a lot of very serious stuff happening. But just because extreme violence occurred does not mean we are not at the point where people want to rip this country to shreds. So perhaps we had a lot of people who didn't want to go to a major conflict. There's no dividing line. I'm sorry. I think the split today is worse than we've seen it. And I've looked at a lot of historical polling and the data, and I think it's been bad. It's been worse. But it's kind of like saying this. You think now is the most, fraught time? There was a period where we were going downhill. Yeah, but when you're going on a roller coaster, you go up to the top very slowly before you drop. They go on to say, it was Burns' suggestion that today's America was more fraught than even the Civil War that Gaynor argued was most egregious, saying, and I can't help but wonder, has Ken Burns seen his own documentary, Ken Burns' documentary on the Civil War? Up to 750,000 Americans dead in a war that ripped the nation apart. Seems a wee bit worse than having a bunch of people argue with each other on social media. Yes, we have a deadly virus in 2021, but it's hardly akin to brother killing brother, ending the scourge of slavery. My response to these individuals is that the Capitol Police are expanding nationwide, California and Florida, and they're going to be setting up offices around the country to act as an intelligence agency. We are seeing, how about this? Laurenbert demands DOJ explain why Capitol rioters are being charged and jailed while BLM rioters who attacked federal buildings are not. Hey, a great question. Seriously. Anarcho-tyranny. Andrew Cuomo of New York murdered 15,000 people. He was warned, if you put sick people in the nursing homes, you will kill them. And he had the Mercy at his disposal, the hospital ship. He had the Javits Center at his disposal. And he knew that if he put sick people in those places, he'd have to give Donald Trump credit. So he chose instead to murder 15,000 people. Now, as to what his true motivations were, that's my personal opinion. For all I know, the guy's just dumb. But do you think anyone will go after this man? No. Dr. Fauci, man. Did you see that exchange with Fauci and Rand Paul? When Rand Paul says lying to Congress is a crime, and this is gain-of-function research, and Fauci says, no, it's not. You see his hand? I watched this video where Fauci's sitting there. He's shaking. He seems terrified by what Rand Paul is saying. Fauci lied. Do you think anyone is going to hold him accountable? No. Now, what can we do? Take care of yourself. Be calm, be smart, be focused, be reasonable. Last thing you want to do is panic. We can already see that there is a strange fracturing happening within this country. And the idea that simply because we have not broken out into all-out war means we're not in one of the worst periods of American history, to me is patently absurd. 37.2% of people polled, with about 2,750 people, which is, as I'm told, for polling, actually a really good sample size. 37.2. I did the math. And in the South, it's 44% with 66% of Republicans. In the West, it's 47% of Democrats. This is massive, in my opinion. So I am worried about it. Here's what we need to do. Build culture, first and foremost. Be peaceful, persuasive, and resourceful. You see how Joe Biden and the Democrats use what happened on January 6th to their advantage. Because, look, the people on January 6th who stormed these barricades to try and go into the Capitol, it was wrong. It was wrong to do, and it was stupid to do. Now, again, I know a lot of people were doting about and didn't know what was happening and were let in by cops, but you can see it. A guy who did not commit any acts of violence, as admitted by the court, 8 months in prison on a felony charge. Yet there's a video of a guy fighting cops, fighting federal police in Portland. No charges. If you cannot see that happening and you think everything's fine, then you're willfully ignorant. I'm sorry. Now, I don't know that there's actually going to be a civil war. I don't know that there's actually going to be balkanization. I don't. Of course not. I'm only saying one simple thing. And I'll phrase it in the form of a question. Since 2010, and maybe even Obama, maybe even before, but let's start with the culture war because, I can speak to my personal experience, and that's my bias, and I'll admit that. Occupy Wall Street. We have seen a dramatic escalation in the fracturing between the culture war left and the culture war right. Since Gamergate, but really Occupy Wall Street is where I first encountered the woke. You get Gamergate, which ultimately leads into this culture war fight on the internet. People eventually find themselves in physical spaces. You get conflict between Antifa and, right-wing groups. You get the election of Donald Trump. We get 5 years of them lying and claiming Trump is an asset of Russia, and here's the evidence, and we've seen it, and he's colluding and all that stuff. It's escalated. Based on everything you've seen over the past several years, with people literally being killed on more than one occasion in these street conflicts, with the media lying every step of the way to trick you and manipulate you, with everything you've seen from the 48 states that were embroiled in a lawsuit started by Texas over the voting laws implemented in the 2020 election, not 48 states together, but at each other's throats, seeing that, seeing the claims made by Donald Trump, seeing January 6th, would you assume the escalation will stop? That's my question. After everything we've seen over the past 10 years, 4 years, 2 years, do you think right now is the moment where everyone just says, you know what? I'm tired of fighting. Come to me, my brother Biden, and let me give you a handshake and say, let's just calm down and carry on with our lives. I don't think so. I just do not think so. I'm not saying I know for sure. When I see stories like this, when I see comments made by, say, Laurenbert, when I see Biden labeling GOP voting laws the greatest threat to American democracy since the Civil War, I'm like, yo, this doesn't end well. The Republicans know and have said it over and over and over again. And H.R. 1 would nationalize elections in this country, and it would rip this country to shreds. It would lower the voting age, I think, to like 16, and introducing a bunch of people with no responsibility, no understanding, being thrust right into the vote. And you know how they'll vote. Many people have pointed out a bunch of other reasons why H.R. 1, the Democrats' voting reform bill, would spell chaos for this country. It is a brazen power grab. It is designed just to massively embolden Democrats' voter base and ensure that they win all elections this point forward. There's some things in it I think are fine. But Republicans have pushed back saying we're going to have our state level voting bills that don't even take away all of the provisions that Democrats have been granted. And for this, Biden says the greatest threat since the Civil War. When the president says that, say whatever you want about Joe Biden, 2020, Donald Trump. I'm saying this man, sworn in, sitting in the Oval Office, has just said, if you do not allow them to nationalize the elections with H.R. 1, effectively nationalize, you are a bigger threat than the Confederacy. And you think we are not escalating? The president said it. Say what you will. We have this story first. Connecting California, Desert Sun. Let's consider a national divorce so Americans can stay friends. What? National divorce? October 15th, 2020. Do you trust your state officials more than the feds? dream of California independence or support breaking the U.S. into regional republics? Then you're a traditional American patriot. Or do you cling to the hopes of national unity? Then you're part of the problem. Whoa. What is this from October? How about this one? From KROC News. Opinion. Political conflicts are balkanizing America. I don't disagree. Then we have this one. Do a quick Google search for civil war. Deseret News 2 weeks ago. Is America headed for another civil war? It's an op-ed for sure. But these are people who are looking at what's going on critically and saying, could this be where we are headed? I don't understand how you can have so many articles. I did not write them. I did not make this up. One day I was reading The Atlantic and I was like, oh, wow, they think a civil war is going to happen. And I looked through the evidence and I looked at history and I looked at the Spanish Civil War. I looked at Weimar Germany. I looked at the history of the American Civil War and I was like, wow, parallels, possibilities, seeds are being planted. Who knows for sure? It may happen. It might not. I don't see a reason why things would not keep escalating. So who are these people who keep writing this stuff? Talking about the fourth turning. MIT has that 1972 paper saying societal collapse by 2040. Are these people just making things up? And what about this from Newsweek? 47% of West Coast Dems, 66% of Southern Republicans want to secede from the U.S. My friends, this is not about fear-mongering. I am simply but a humble man who reads the news, does some investigating, digging into these stories to try and figure out what's true. And the one thing I can tell you is that Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, the establishment have been pushing and entertaining these ideas for some time. It didn't start with them, but it's certainly at the highest levels of government right now. Now, as I've stated, there are some things on YouTube I cannot say. YouTube will delete. There are names I can't say. Joe Biden, the administration has said they're working with the DNC and phone carriers to censor private text messages. Jen Psaki came out and said, if you violate the rules of one platform, you should be banned across all the others. They have admitted that they are flagging misinformation for Facebook. The government has gone beyond overstepping. And you think this is where things de-escalate? I remember back in 2018 with the Antifa Proud Boys stuff, I had these conservative reporters telling me that I was nuts and exaggerating for arguing that the articles I was seeing were on point and that the escalation was coming. They said, oh, you're crazy. The federal government would never let that happen. The security apparatus is too strong. And I said, what makes you think the ideological fracturing won't reach the highest levels of government? Presidents have to run for elections. They have to get their base riled up to vote for them. Here we are. It's at the level of the presidency. It's at the level of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Mark Milley, I want to understand white rage. Now, okay, let me slow down one quick second. Perhaps the reason why the U.S. won't balkanize, and the reason why there would not be a civil war, and why things could de-escalate, well, if one side won, right? If the Democrats, the culture war left, the identitarian left, the critical race theorists have won, then maybe there will be a de-escalation. It's possible. I mean, take a look at what Laurenbert said. The Capitol, people at the Capitol are being charged very heavily. A guy who was trespassing, nonviolent, 8 months in prison. BLM rioters, extremists burning down buildings. Nothing. Now, okay, the rioters who attacked some of the federal buildings did get convicted, but a lot of them did get cut loose as well. You see the displacement? It may be that the ideological left already has all the cultural institutions and now the governmental institutions. They don't have the Supreme Court, but they have more than enough power to say, you know what, we're going to go after anybody who dare oppose us. H.R. 1. And that's where the ultimate point comes to. The Democrats' new voting bill. And there's some things in it that I think are fine. But there's many things in it that I think are dangerous, mostly the lowering the voting age. And to be honest, nationalizing the vote. Creating federal rules as to what the states are supposed to do. The states have the right to determine their own elections. If they get that, that's it. Republicans will never win again. I mean, maybe Republicans will do what they've always done and be forced to adapt and change and become much more leftist. That's why I say in 10 years, the Republicans will probably be socialists complaining about the communist Democrats. Perhaps. I can't see the future. Let's go back to the beginning on this one. An activist for Black Lives Matter who said that he wants black autonomous zones in D.C. with their own mayors And of course you're welcome to come, but it would be like a Native American reservation owned and controlled by the Native Americans. Do we really want that kind of balkanization? It's bad enough we deal with the history of this nation and the bad things that happened. The Native American reservations, sad stories. I am not proud of the horrible things done throughout history by humanity. No, but we try to do better and look forward, not backwards. These are people who want to go backwards. They want to rewind the clock on civil rights, and they're willing to fight to do it. One thing I said several years ago is that one of the challenges of authoritarians in the United States is the Constitution, probably the biggest. The First and Second Amendments, oh boy. Take a look at Canada, the UK, Australia. Look what they're doing with the lockdowns. They can't do it here the same way. State autonomy, 10th Amendment, 9th Amendment, the Bill of Rights in general. How do you get rid of a constitution? Well, there's one way. Civil war or balkanization. And balkanization may be a precursor towards civil war. I mean, let's say a region, the country breaks up into different regions, and then 5 years later, much like with Texas, they only last about the Republic of Texas, they join the greater union. The states could break apart, and then there could be a proposal, and then the states vote to re-enter a new union. Maybe that means there won't be a constitution or a Bill of Rights. Maybe the regions would refuse to join without one. Maybe each region would make their own specific constitution, and then maybe they wouldn't mesh with each other, and then maybe one region just decides to take the others. Maybe, like the Civil War, there are two big, there will be factions. We have the North and the South, the Confederacy and the Union. Maybe in this Civil War, there will be 5 different factions all fighting each other. Or maybe none of it. Maybe, just maybe, this is that one time. Finally, right now, people say, I've just had enough. I want to watch TV and play video games, and I do not want to fight anymore. That's possible. But that does mean that one ideology will persist. And if that's the case, it's likely the woke ideology. If people just say, I've had enough, the left will just slam through the gates and take what they want. So where do we go from here? I think the key is building culture. Many conservatives have kids. Raise your kids, teach your kids, instill your values, homeschool your kids. There's no winning this because we're in the 4th and 5th generation of warfare. There's no winning this with what the left does. If the left wants to get violent, we need them to stop. The police don't want to do it. Well, then I say take care of yourselves, defend your communities to the best of your abilities, but be defensive, not offensive. Focus on being the good guy. Batman isn't the instigator, for the most part. Batman does not let people die. And to his own, there are many great storylines about the negatives of that. But the good guys say, you know what? We're going to take care of ourselves. We're going to defend ourselves. We're going to have families. We're going to build culture and inspire others. Peaceful, persuasive, resourceful. So I don't know where we go from here. But I do know that a lot of people are angry on the left and the right. And we'll see. If the sentiment about racial segregation keeps persisting and growing, don't be surprised if this guy like Addison Sarter, don't be surprised when they get what they want. I'll leave it there. Next segment's coming up tonight at 8 p.m. over at youtube.com/TimCastIRL. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you all then.